VNRCs really for several years. We were involved in an effort to have a commission formed to look at the future of Act 250, served as an advisor to that commission, and we're involved for the past 2 years in working with the House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee on updating the bill, which has actually resulted in legislation that passed out of the House just before town meeting. That's on hold now for completely understandable reasons. While a long-term, an update of Act 250 is still a priority of ours, we understand that the legislature is appropriately dealing with the financial crisis and the COVID crisis facing Vermont, and likely will be doing that at least for the short foreseeable future. Our understanding is that this summer, both the House and Senate are going to try to tackle some of the policy issues that aren't related to the current crisis. So there is a possibility and a hope that they'll move forward on it. And just to say, there were many reasons that we supported modernizing Act 250, and we're not sure what the future holds for Vermont and the country and the world. We are going to come out of this crisis. We might be facing some new realities, and we think that Act 250 should continue to play a role in shaping how Vermont changes and develops over time. So this remains a priority of ours. This week, we're going to just provide some background information. I know there are some folks on the call who are practitioners who are pretty well versed in Act 250 and how it works. This week might not be as interesting. Next week, we're going to tackle kind of what the legislative proposals are, what's in the bill, what's not, what could be, and maybe get into some of the more interesting and potentially more controversial issues. So with that, we'll get going. As I said, we're going to provide some context today. We're going to go back to the beginning of what the forces were that prompted the legislature to enact Act 250, talk about what that process is, what the issues that it addresses, what the various criteria are, what kind of development it applies to, how Act 250 has changed over the years. It's been 50 years since it was enacted, and it has seen several changes, some of them significant. And then we're just going to start getting into the process of updating Act 250 to address some of the contemporary challenges facing the state. So the 1960s were a very different time. Most folks know the kind of the history, the post-European colonization history of Vermont. Starting in the late 1700s, there was a population boom. And then around the time of the Civil Wars, there was really a stagnant population. What happened was the rural areas of the state, the hill farms, depopulated, while the historic centers, the Burlingtons and Montpeliers and St. Albans and Benningtons, saw modest population growth for about 100 years. But the state as a whole had a relatively stable or stagnant population. But in the 1960s, that changed. The interstate highways came to the state. IBM opened their facility in the early 60s in Essex. Just as an aside, Tom Watson, the founder of IBM, was an avid skier, had a house in Stowe, and that's one of many examples of an entrepreneur liking Vermont, coming here for the quality of life and the environment, and starting a business that transformed the state. We had a lot of ski area development, especially in southern Vermont, that was unregulated. And then there's the kind of counterculture back to the land movement, where Vermont was a place with a lot of cheap land and kind of a libertarian philosophy where it was a live and let live kind of a place. So it attracted a lot of new residents. There was very little municipal land use planning and development regulation in the state. Some towns had zoning since the 1930s, but none of the rural communities did. Few of the ski areas did. It was really anything goes. And that also applied to the state government. There was very little environmental regulation, either at the state or federal level. And then there was just a growing awareness about environmental issues. Silent Spring came out in the early 60s, and it really did open a lot of eyes. There started to be some of the early national legislation, the National Wilderness Act in the 60s, and kind of a lot of thought building up to some of the more landmark laws that were passed in the 1970s. And that was the same in Vermont. There was the ban on billboards, the bottle return law, and just as a shameless plug, VNRC was founded in 1963 to bring together people around this growing awareness about environmental environmentalism. So that was the kind of the culture at the time. The ski area development in southern Vermont, as the legend goes, was really critical in changing the attitude or raising the awareness of Governor Dean Davis. There was raw sewage floating across the ground. There was unchecked hillside development. It was really a mess, and he got a tour of some of those developments and decided that something needed to happen. So he formed the Governor's Commission on Environmental Control, known widely as the Gibb Commission after its chair, Arthur Gibb, who was a legislator at the time. They held a series of meetings across Vermont, a lot of public involvement in that, and they recommended a number of new environmental laws. And the centerpiece of that was a new state system for reviewing and controlling large-scale development. And that's what Act 250 is. There were some other things done that I think I'll mention later around that time, but that was the beginning of Act 250. Again, unchecked development, really unprecedented and in several generations population growth, new investment in large-scale infrastructure like the interstate, new economic development activities. It's just raised awareness about what the future of Vermont could be, and some people were concerned that it could be something quite different and something that they would change the character of the state in an adverse way. So they passed Act 250, and now we'll get into kind of some of what the meat of it was. John, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so in setting up Act 250, there were really two components to the law that really make it work. And one is the process, and one are what are the criteria. So the process was really, very obviously well thought out in the original law, and it was designed to really work in a cohesive way. So the process was there would be 9 regional district commissions that would process Act 250 permits. There was a lot of discussion. The framers of Act 250 believed it was really vital to keep the process regional and as informal as possible. And they also believed that it was vital to have the program run by an independent board of people from varied backgrounds. So there was an environmental board set up to oversee the 9 regional district commissions. The 9 board members, they really did have you could have business people, you had some people with environmental experience, they came from all the different corners of the state. They were all appointed by the governor, and there was 8 members and a chair, and the chair served at the pleasure of the governor. And even though that really it could have affected the independence of the board, it really didn't in the early years of Act 250. The administrations left Act 250 alone and left the chair to basically manage the board, and the board to manage the district commissions. And as we get into potential changes to Act 250, it's important to note that the shift in independence did in the 90s, in the early 90s, it was a shift away from the independence of Act 250. There's a famous example of VNRC's former executive director, Elizabeth Courtney. She was the chair of the environmental board at one point, and she came up for reappointment, and the Republican Senate didn't want to confirm her, and it became very political in terms of the type of decisions Act 250 was making. And Governor Dean, he, as a governor, spoke often about specific Act 250 projects, which for the first time kind of triggered this debate about what role, how independent is Act 250. But it was designed to be an independent citizen board overseeing these citizen commissions. I think is there another slide on process? No.
Yeah, the missing piece, and this has been kind of has dogged Act 250 since it was adopted. It was intended to have 3 components. It had the development review process, which was enacted in 1970, has been Act 250 as we know it for 50 years. There was also a capability and development plan, which was basically a development suitability plan, a land suitability plan for the state. that looked at where are those development constraints, where are areas of steep slopes and wildlife habitat and wetlands, and that was used to evaluate the location of projects and how they might be, what their impacts might be. And that was adopted. And then there was to be a state land use plan, which was basically a statewide zoning map, a plan that would say certain uses would be allowed in certain areas at certain densities, certain lot sizes. It was actually a extremely bold idea. And it was done in response to the lack of widespread land use planning in the state. It's important to note that the idea was that the land use plan would apply to those communities that didn't adopt their own local land use plan and zoning bylaws. But that was never adopted. And then the capability and development plan was used without a land use plan, but in the late, I forget exactly when it was, the late 70s, about 1980, the legislation was changed. There were some new criteria added dealing with some local impacts and public investment. But the law was changed to say explicitly that the capability and development plan did not play a role in the development review process as part of Act 250. So that has been a missing piece that a lot of people have pointed to as the partial failure of Act 250, that it doesn't look at the context, at the site or the location of a project. It just looks at the environmental and community impacts. So it's arguable whether the state land use plan would have made a drastic difference. I think most folks who've studied the law think that it would have. But those are the missing pieces that were part of the original vision, but were never implemented. So what does Act 250 apply to? It's a little different today than when it was first adopted initially. And really for the first, I think it was about 35, 40 years, it applied to commercial and industrial development that involved either 1 acre or 10 acres of land. And the difference being if a community had a municipal plan and zoning bylaws and subdivision regulations, those 3 tools in place, then you were what you were considered a 10-acre town, that you were handling development of the commercial industrial development up to 10 acres locally. If you didn't have those tools in place, you were a 1-acre town. And that meant that Act 250 applied to smaller developments, 1 acre or greater. It also initially applied to 10 housing units or 10 residential lots. It applied to any new road that was 800 feet or longer. That was known as the road rule. And it applied to all development, including agriculture and forestry, above an elevation of 2,500 feet. So the highest elevation on mountaintops and ridgelines in the state. It did not regulate agriculture and forestry below 2,500 feet. So then, John, you're going to walk through the review process and the various criteria, right?
Yeah. Before I do, just on jurisdiction, I think it's important to note that so jurisdiction has been hotly contested ever since Act 250 was enacted. So Brian laid out sort of the general structure, but once you have an Act 250 permit, there are major debates about, do you need an amendment to that permit? There's a lot of case law about that came from the Environmental Board in the early days of Act 250. There have been really vigorous debates about when enough acreage is involved to trigger Act 250, and this concept of what's the involved land associated with the project. And we'll talk about a little later some of the exemptions to Act 250. There have been a lot of debates about carving out exemptions from Act 250 based on some of these jurisdictional battles. And one thing that I think we've learned, and we'll get into this next time when we talk about modernizing the law, is the jurisdiction really wasn't set up in a way to look at kind of where we want development. It's that planning piece that Brian mentioned. I think people thought that the planning piece would come into play and really fill in that gap about how we're regulating development in different areas, where are the resources that we're trying to protect, where do we want development in our historic settlement areas, where don't we want development. That's really not how the jurisdictional rules of Act 250 were set up. And so we've had a lot of debates over the years trying to apply Act 250 to our values as they've changed. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Brian.
Yeah, actually, I want to one other thing. So um, it's important to see how much development is being captured by Act 250, and nobody really seems to know. There was at one time in the early 90s, I believe, a statistic that about 40% of commercial development is subject to Act 250. I think a lot more communities have adopted subdivision regulations since then, so there's probably a lot more 10-acre towns. So I don't think there is as much commercial development being captured. We've talked a lot about forest fragmentation as an environmental threat to the state, and we've done a lot of research on tracking forest fragmentation. That's the subdivision of land into smaller parcels, typically for residential development. And some of the statistics that we've seen are that Act 250 is only covering about 2 or 3% of all residential subdivision in the state, and that's capturing about 7 or 8% of new housing lots. Basically, the larger subdivisions are going through Act 250, but not the smaller ones. And the smaller ones are by far the more common types of subdivisions going on 2, 3, 4, 5 lots at a time. So
yeah, that's a really important point. I had that note that, yeah, I think we're going to talk going forward about how broadly should Act 250 apply and kind of revisit what it applies to. And that's what we've been doing. So let's get a little bit more specific into the process. So as Act 250 was set up, you had the district commissions, which I mentioned before, and the environmental board. So the district commissions process at this point hundreds of applications per year. They break projects into 2 categories, major projects and minor projects. Only approximately 20% of projects before district commissions are major projects. And a major project is a project that has a hearing. The projects that do have hearings feel like mini trials. Like as I said at the beginning, the idea was to make Act 250 as informal as possible. I think the as possible is the key word there, because what we've seen over the decades is that when you do have a hearing, most of, not all of those 20% of majors, they feel like little mini trials, and people usually bring lawyers to represent them and their expert witnesses on their evidentiary disputes and all the type of things that you would see. So importantly, Act 250 was set up with environmental board, as I noted earlier, hearing appeals. So appeals from the district commission of a major project would go to the environmental board. And in the early days of Act 250, the first 2 decades, I would say, maybe 3, the environmental board rendered many, many decisions that really brought to life the criteria of Act 250. And I would submit that it's those early decisions of the environmental board that really have made Act 250 as effective as it is. We'll go through the criteria in a little while, and they're good criteria, but they really needed a board like the environmental board to tell Vermonters, to tell applicants, to tell people participating in the proceeding, what do these criteria mean, and how does it work? Really important to note that that the way Act 250 was set up is that appeals are what they call de novo, which means you do it all over again. So the district commission proceeding, as I said, for the majors, could feel like a mini trial. All what happens before those commissions, you do it all again before the environmental board for whatever the issues that are on appeal. And that's been something that we've been debating in Act 250 ever since, with some people saying that's redundant and duplicative, and other people saying, well, having the de novo appeal allows commissions to be very more informal, and because they're not creating a formal record that they need to, that will be reviewed on appeal, and it allows the commissions to have less formal proceedings. Also important to note is, as designed, this concept of party status, who could participate in Act 250, the theory was we're going to make it really easy for people to participate before the district commission and even before the environmental board. There were statutory parties, state agencies, adjoining landowners were parties. And then there was a category of parties of, if you could quote unquote materially assist the district commission or the board, you could be a party, which basically made it very easy for people interested in the impacts of a development project to get involved. for groups like VNRC to get involved. So it was set up to be a low bar for party status, but also important to note, and I don't think a lot of people know this, is appeal rights to the Supreme Court. So you'd go district commission, you could appeal to the environmental board, then to the Supreme Court. Only statutory parties and the applicant could appeal to the Supreme Court as Act 250 was drafted. So, groups like VNRC and other citizen groups were not able to reach the Supreme Court unless an applicant appealed something to the Supreme Court in the early days of Act 250. And we'll talk about when that changed in a little while.
And John, just thought the statutory parties are adjoining landowners, state agencies, regional planning commissions, municipalities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And at that time, if you were not in that category, you would basically materially assist would be how you would get into the proceeding. There was another standard, but that is the standard that was most relied on by the commissions and the board. So the criteria. So this is going to be, you could do whole webinars on any one of these criteria, but really what I want to say about this is that the framers were really visionary, really incredibly visionary. As Brian was mentioning at the beginning, this Act 250 came about in the context of the broader environmental movement that was happening all over the country. And the law, Act 250 addressed environmental issues, community impacts, planning issues, energy issues, agricultural and forestry issues, wildlife habitat, natural areas, rare and threatened species. And I'll just briefly, you can go to the next slide, kind of run through, just a very, very superficial description of how these issues have been addressed. So air permitting, air issues could be anything from, sources that would require an A&R permit for air pollution. There are very few of those in the state, quite frankly, because we just don't have those sort of major sources. But Act 250 over the years have looked at impacts of, a large subdivision with fireplaces, noise issues, dust from trucking, all really under the air category. Cars, parking, and transportation. Early on in the 70s and 80s, Act 250 was looking at those issues long before we were talking about climate change. The water issues are a whole host of issues, and I've listed some on the slide. You could read it. I like to think of the water issues as kind of broken up into the categories of, and you'll see that A&R's interface with Act 250 really comes to light in these criteria. So you have water issues where A&R is regulating and issuing permits, and then you have water issues where A&R is not doing that. So, for example, wastewater and stormwater and drinking water and wetlands, there are A&R permitting programs. Act 250 also address those issues, but the way that the law evolved to work is that A&R permits create presumptions of compliance with those issues. There are other issues, streams and rivers and riparian buffers and shore and floodways, and issues of broader hydrologic change if it's a very large project where A&R is not issuing a permit, but they are key. Act 250, and this is another important point, they don't have technical staff. There's a district coordinator that staffs the district commission that is made up of people who are essentially volunteers. They get a small per diem, and the district coordinator basically helps the process move, but is not a technical expert. So A&R's technical expertise is really key. So on issues of air and water, drinking water and surface water and waste, the commissions have always relied on A&R, although it's the commission's decision, not A&R's, except when you have those A&R permits that create the presumptions. Those permits have a little bit more evidentiary weight in the process, but there's always been this kind of relationship between A&R and Act 250. The next slide. So I mentioned the permit presumptions. I don't have much more to say about that, except that, as Brian noted, at the beginning of Act 250, there was almost no A&R permitting. There's been a lot more A&R permitting. So we've had a debate over the last 10 to 15 years about should we take another look at how A&R permitting comes into play in Act 250. So there's a whole host of criteria related to wildlife issues, habitat issues. RINA is rare and irreplaceable natural areas. RTEs is rare, threatened, and endangered species. So here there are not A&R permits, but A&R plays a really important role in addressing all these issues, but not a dispositive role. Any party can put in evidence on these issues, but over the years, A&R, how they have defined necessary wildlife habitat, which is very narrow. And Brian mentioned forest fragmentation earlier, as a concern that VNRC has had. The broader habitat impacts of development are not addressed by this issue. You're talking about habitat that's necessary for the survival of a species. It's really sugared out to be like deer wintering habitat or black bear feeding areas. So it's a very important criteria, and it's been effective in addressing some of the narrow wildlife habitat issues, but not really broadly. And same with the natural areas and rare, threatened, and endangered species. Really, the commissions have relied on A&R's expertise in identifying those areas. Examples of natural areas are things like fens and the sandplain communities out in Chittenden County, these rare communities. So and the A&R is really, they're cataloging these areas, and I think the commissions really look heavily to their work. The same with endangered and threatened species, and there's an endangered species committee that, along with A&R, plays an important role. But it really, Act 250 at the forefront of dealing with these issues in the land use law. Next slide. So agricultural and forest soils. So agricultural soils, Act 250 has done a robust job dealing with impacts to primary agricultural soils. And there was some case law in the 2000s that really, for a while, impacts to ag soils were easily mitigated. So if you were going to have an impact, you could basically pay to conserve land to mitigate those impacts. And the way the criteria is written is you have to avoid and minimize before you can mitigate impacts. And there was some case law in the early 2000s that reaffirmed that. So that's really, I think Act 250 has done a very good job of dealing with agricultural soils. So forest soils is in the law, but there's really no case law on protecting forest soils or forest health. So that's been an ineffective criteria. And again, one of the reasons why VNRC is focused on closing that gap by dealing with forest health and fragmentation. There are community impacts addressed in this. So you can see the statute is really going category by category. Community impacts like impact on governmental services, traffic. There's a whole host of case law that you could do multiple webinars on, address Act 250 and how it's addressed traffic. Public investments is a criteria written right into the law that basically says is that if the public is investing in areas, public lands, parks, roadways, a project can't interfere with those investments. So that was really a landmark criteria. And all these criteria, what I mentioned about the environmental board case law, they've fleshed all of these issues out and in a way that has, I think, set really clear and robust standards for dealing with all these issues. Planning is part of the law. Town and regional plans, you have to conform to those. We've learned over the years through case law that if you want your town and regional plan to have an impact in Act 250, you have to have very specific language in your plan. And if it's very specific and it applies to a project could be conditioned or denied in order to conform with the plan. The concept of existing settlements is in Act 250 in the sense that if you're not in an existing settlement, and that has been a term defined also by case law, by the environmental board, then you have to address the impacts, the fiscal impacts to the community where the development is in dealing with that sprawl or scattered development. And finally, there's a criteria on settlement patterns, which is one of the success stories of changes to Act 250, is one of the few. With this criteria, it's 9L. It used to be called rural growth areas, and nobody knew what that meant. Despite a couple of cases before the environmental board, that was an area where the environmental board really even couldn't clearly say what that criteria is supposed to be requiring. and we changed it to basically be a sprawl, a criteria to deal with whether your a project was contributing to sprawl. We can talk a little bit more of that later. Energy, Act 250 was at the forefront of energy efficiency and conservation long before the Efficiency Vermont existed. The Department of Public Service, the Public Service Department, was commenting on Act 250 projects, saying, here's what you need to do to meet the state-of-the-art standards for energy efficiency and how to conserve energy. Lately, we've tried to infuse climate into Act 250 to some degree. Climate was not an issue that was really being discussed, and it was not really the issue of the day in 1970 when Act 250 was enacted. But it is now, obviously, our greatest environmental challenge, I think people would agree. And there's been some small attempts to infuse climate into Act 250, but not in a significant way. And that's been another issue we've been talking about in terms of modernizing Act 250.
Yeah, and John, just to really highlight a point that you made, the progress that was made in energy efficiency and energy conservation through Act 250, it was taking a fairly basic short criteria and an activist public service department who wanted to promote energy efficiency and used Act 250 to really set a high bar for new development. And that was not necessarily inevitable when the law was passed, but it was administrations who saw the value and the need for energy conservation and energy efficiency, and made a real effort to promote that through the development review process.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and that's what I was kind of trying to say with all those, like the habitat criteria and the natural areas and the water criteria having to do with floodways and streams. Really, participation by the ANR, by the Public Service Department, by groups like VNRC and other groups that came in and basically raised issues and shapes precedent, right? And on their own, just writing necessary wildlife habitat is not meaningful. Writing efficiency and conservation is not, really doesn't tell the story about what's going to happen. But those early years of Act 250, all that robust participation in those decisions from the board really shaped Act 250. So this is still me?
Yeah.
So changes over there. So there have been changes over the years to Act 250. And from our perspective, very few have been positive. It seems that for a very long time, I am old, but I am not so old that I know what was on in the 70s and 80s with Act 250 in the legislature. But I've been around since the 90s. And since the 90s, I would say every year, somebody comes in looking for an exemption to Act 250. There are a lot of Act 250 exemptions written into the law. You can find them in two different places. They're in the definition of development. There's a bunch of carve-outs from what that definition is. And then there's also a list of exemptions in 10 VSA 6086. And they range from everything from slate quarries to temporary horse shows to closing landfills to certain types of projects in designated downtowns to certain types of housing projects to distribution lines that are run. So there's just been, and even if this is a long list and you can read it, but one of the concerns that VNRC has had over the years is that we can't keep having these piecemeal changes and exemptions to the law, that are not looking at it holistically. What are we doing to the already limited jurisdiction that Brian noted? If we're going to keep coming in and saying Act 250 doesn't apply to this and it doesn't apply to that, we're not really thinking about the impact on the program itself. Next slide. So in addition to just the outright exemptions, there have been contractions of Act 250 jurisdiction over the years. So the road rule that Brian noted was eliminated over 10 years ago, I would guess at this point. I mentioned some of the other jurisdictional contractions. So that has been a concern for VNRC. Next slide. So some of the positive changes, and Brian, I'll ask you to jump in here. So there was a positive change to the ag soil criteria that was associated with the growth center program that was created in the 2000s, and then the settlement pattern criteria I noted. Brian, you want to?
Yeah, with regard to ag soils, that kind of pay to pave tr tradition that went away in early 2000s because of the court cases. We revised, Act 250 was revised to say that that should only happen, that offsite mitigation where you can pay to develop the entirety of a parcel of high quality ag soils, only should happen in certain circumstances. The challenge has been what those circumstances are subject to interpretation. It's under extraordinary circumstances. It was intended to be if you're in a heavily developed area where new development made sense, it filled out the fabric of an existing downtown or an adjacent area. But out in the countryside, you shouldn't just be able to pay to remove those soils. You ought to be protecting them on site and leaving them available for agriculture. So it was an improvement. It tried to clarify that standard. I think it's still playing out as far as what those circumstances that that offsite mitigation should apply to. And then, John, I think you did a good job of talking about settlement patterns. It really is a criteria that says if you're in an existing settlement, if you're in a developed area, then try to reinforce a pattern that's walkable, that's provides a connectivity to neighboring properties. And if you're out on a commercial strip and you're going to promote that continuation of just piecemeal, incremental development along our highways, then it shouldn't be allowed in those areas. And there's limited, this is a relatively new criteria. It's fairly limited in how it's been interpreted by the court. So I still think there's an opportunity for this to play out over time and to become even more meaningful than it has been. And I think the research that we've done is that I don't know that if it's stopped strip development, but it's probably resulted in some site improvements to make new development a little bit more walkable, a little bit more kind of incorporate more smart growth principles.
So the most significant change, and from our perspective, the most detrimental change to Act 250 was the so-called permit reform changes in 2004. So remember back to the beginning of the presentation where it talked about the framers really carefully thought about how Act 250 was going to work with the 9 district commissions and then the environmental board overseeing it, and the board being made up of people from varied walks of life and being independent. And we talked a lot in this presentation about the work that the board had done to shape decisions over the time Act 250 has been in place. And in 2004, there was a lot of pent up. There was so many, from my perspective, so many environmental board decisions by 2004 that everybody was unhappy at one point or another by a decision, because that's what happens. I'm a lawyer. I practiced Act 250 law for a long time, and I've been involved with cases that I've won, and I've been involved with cases that I've lost. And I think everybody feels that way, and everybody, liked some decisions, didn't like others. And so the move was to eliminate the environmental board, basically send appeals of Act 250 to the Superior Court, and create an environmental division of the Superior Court, create a new Natural Resources Board to oversee the district commissions, which was the former environmental board's role. And the effects of this have been, there have been a number of effects. One has been that the environmental board's connection to the district commissions was really severed. They had this appellate authority and this administration authority that when you added them together, really created a powerful board to basically say, this is how we're interpreting Act 250. This is what these criteria means. This is how we're determining jurisdiction. And there was a really healthy interplay between the environmental board and the district commissions that made the process, for my opinion, work better and created clarity in terms of how the law worked. And by infusing the Superior Court, you basically now have three different entities. You've got the commissions making decisions. You have the NRB, the Natural Resources Board, that not only administers the commissions, but is a party to the environmental court proceedings, but they don't have final say. They're just a party. And then you have the court rendering a final decision. And so you just don't have as much a clarity of voice in terms of how we're interpreting the law and how we're implementing the law. And it's created some tensions between commission decisions and the NRB's positions in proceedings and interpretation of court decisions. So, and it's made the appeals process, courts are formal processes. The environmental board was more formal than the district commissions, but it was still, there was more flexibility in implementing procedural rules and evidentiary rules. And, you're in court now, and it's just a very different process.
Yeah, I like to characterize it as actually 50 was vertically integrated. It was all the administration and the appeals all were interconnected in it and coordinated. And we've lost that. Now we have three entities who have relationships to each other, but it's not always a neat fit.
Yeah. So this is this has been an issue that VNRC has tracked for a while, and I just think I think Brian described it well, but the system was really designed to work in one way, and I think what happened in 2004 is we really kind of pulled it apart, and so we've been since then kind of watching what the impact of that pulling apart of the system has been.
Yeah. So just it's important to note that it's been 50 years. A lot has happened in 50 years, and just some of the other changes since 1970. The early 70s were really a great time for environmental legislation and protecting our natural resources at the federal level. We had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. We've had a lot of state regulations since then. We created the Agency of Natural Resources. The 80s were a time when we saw a lot of environmental progress in the state with wetlands laws and solid waste laws. We have a much different process for regulating stormwater and other water quality impacts. We have new shoreland information program that was created just a couple of years ago. So there is a lot more state regulation than existed in the early 70s. Likewise, about the same time that Act 250 was adopted, the Municipal and Regional Planning Act was adopted. It's known as Chapter 117 in the late 60s. That kind of was a pretty pretty detailed and progressive enabling legislation for local and regional planning. Our regional planning commissions were created. That happened just before Act 250 was passed. And then in the late 80s, Act 200 was passed, which really overhauled those planning processes. And the goal was to make towns more responsible for taking control over land use in their communities and regulating development. That's been a partial success. Some of the pieces of Act 200 were abandoned in the 1990s. Some communities have embraced it, some haven't. So local planning and regional planning across the state is very uneven. It's still discretionary. Communities can choose to do as much or little as they want, and they do. Also, John had mentioned downtowns. I think there's 6 designation programs that have been created starting in the late 1990s with the Downtown Development Act. So we have designated downtowns, which are a program intended to take the most impacted areas of the state, our key downtowns in our regional centers like Montpelier and Burlington and St. Albans and St. Johnsbury and Brattleboro, and promote redevelopment in those areas. We have a kind of a smaller scale program called Village Centers, which is easier to apply to, which applies to about 130 last I saw, Village Centers. And likewise, that's kind of an incentive program for the commercial core of our small villages. We have a Growth Centers program, which kind of started off with a bang. It hasn't, it's only applied to about 6 communities, and that was not a redevelopment program, but a new development program. And then most recently, we had neighborhood development areas, which are a designation for areas that don't involve impacts on certain natural resources and are located in close proximity to our village centers and our downtowns, where residential development is encouraged in those areas. So those are kind of a different context for planning and development in the state than existed in the early 1970s. So we've kind of hit on a lot of the issues about why it needs to be modernized, how to modernize it. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of agreement over ways to do it. About, I think it was 4 years ago, I guess, the legislature, as I mentioned earlier, passed the Commission on the Future of Act 250, the next 50 years. They went through a pretty robust public hearing process and analysis, came up with a bunch of recommendations. The House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife has wrestled for a year and a half over that. I mean, it's a major task, and I give them a ton of credit for spending the time on it and understanding, kind of what the potential is and what would be appropriate changes. There were some controversial pieces of that were adopted in the legislation that passed. There were other controversial proposals that seemed like they were heading towards adoption, but they were dropped before the bill was voted on. And our hope is to kind of start from where the House left off just before town meeting next week and talk about some of the changes that are being anticipated or contemplated, and what that might look like should the legislature have the ability, which I think we all hope they do, to not just deal with the crisis before us, but to take a look at how we're going to change some of our landmark laws after that crisis goes away and we return to some form of normal. John, do you have anything to add to the kind of where we're going? I note that it's 10 of 1. We want to make sure folks have questions. We have an opportunity for that. And I'd say welcome questions now, but we'd also welcome suggestions for what kind of information you'd like to hear next Thursday when we talk about the future.
I think you've set it up well, and I think see if people have any questions. Like you said at the beginning, this was really a baseline I think it's important as we talk about where we're going in modernizing Act 250 that we just have kind of lay out how the law was set up and where some of the changes that have been made. And next time we could really dig into some of the specific proposals for changing the law that are under consideration now.
So Stephanie, you're gonna handle questions. Want to just remind people the chat function of Zoom lets you type in a question, and it will appear to the right of all of the panels.
That's right. We do have one question. It's our indigenous lands, known sites, burial grounds, and et cetera, protected under Act 250.
There is a criteria dealing with historic preservation and archaeological sites. So under criterion 8, historic sites and archaeological sites are protected, and there's a lot of really good case law around that. And the Division of Historic Preservation actually has been very active over the years in dealing with those issues. So they have a good matrix for sort of archaeological sites. Many of them are Native American sites. And Brian, would you add anything to that?
No, I'm wondering, John, there was a lot of controversy up in northern Franklin County around Highgate with some land subdivisions and residential development that were impacting some indigenous burial sites. I don't know if Act 250 played a big role in any of those. I know some of those projects didn't go through Act 250 because they were of a scale that didn't trigger it. But you're right. The development community is actually pretty critical of the historic preservation criteria and how it's applied, because the Division for Historic Preservation has been good on requiring archaeological assessments of projects before they go forward. And that has been, I think, another example of where you had a good criteria, but it really was made useful and valuable with the administration taking it seriously.
Yeah, and I actually, with that question, prompted my memory that I don't know how I didn't specifically mention historic sites and archaeological areas, but also aesthetics, which is part of Act 250, which has been very unique, right, to have an aesthetics criteria. And the historic criteria is actually kind of wrapped up in that same criteria that deals with aesthetics.
Okay, we do have some other questions. One is, has there been discussion of Act 250 revisions specifically for towns without zoning or land use regulations? The other was about whether there's any language we can suggest for towns to use to support Act 250 in their town plans.
Those sound like your questions, Brian.
I don't know if we have any guidance. We do have a community strategies for protecting forest and wildlife habitat that has some sample policy language. Really, what the case law that's come down has been the policies in a town plan need to be clear and unambiguous and clear and able to guide the average person. So really, it comes down to if you have a wishy-washy policy, we prefer not to see development on this mountaintop. That's not going to cut it. And the environmental board and the courts had a case where they decided if it's vague, we're going to look to the zoning bylaws to see if they prevent it or not. But if you say there shall not be development in this area, there shall not be development in wetlands or in floodplains or in any other kind of feature, that has bearing. That provides the clear guidance to the district commission. And there was a great case recently down at Exit 1 in Hartford, where there was clear regional plan language that prohibited retail development at the within interchange areas. The district commission denied a project. The environmental court approved it. It went to the Supreme Court and it got a very strong decision that kind of validated that concept that if your language is clear and unambiguous, it should have guidance. It should guide the development in Act 250.
Maybe we could provide a link to that case because that is sort of the last word on this issue. So we could, Stephanie, we can give you that link. And VNRC was we're an amicus.
Yes.
In that case?
Yes.
Yeah.
With Preservation Trust of Vermont.
Yeah. Other questions?
Well, I'm not sure, Brian, if you also addressed Act 250 revision specifically for towns without zoning or land use regulations. But there's also.
Yeah, I would say that if you don't have zoning or subdivision regulations, the most important way you can have a role in shaping large-scale development, the bigger development projects in communities, is through having clear policies in your town plan.
Okay. The question about wildlife corridors is, will wildlife corridors be addressed with the changes that are being discussed, or is that pretty much off the table given the current changes?
The changes in the bill passed out of the House has a very good, very strong new criteria that deals with forest blocks, large tracts of forest land, and wildlife connectivity. It's probably, from our standpoint, one of the most significant improvements to Act 250 that would be included in that bill. And we're hopeful that at some point in the future, we will have that criteria. Anything else, Stephanie?
That seems to be it for now. If anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat and we'll get to it.
Well, I do see another one that although you answered it, John, about intervenor funding.
Oh yeah, I answered that earlier. There is no, we've advocated for years to have a public advocate and intervenor funding to help citizens through the Act 250 process, and we've not been able to get that through. It's still an issue. We'll talk about next time the process issues. The potential process changes to Act 250 have been, I think, probably the most controversial part of the discussion in the legislature. And part of that discussion was around issues like intervenor support. They're not currently in the bill, but it's certainly an issue that that still exists. So we could talk about that next time. And I hope people will join. And so next time we'll get into, we can go through what the House has done. And we can go through what the Act 250 Commission on the future of Act 250 had recommended. And, you know, as Brian said, what's in the bill, what could be in the bill, what should be in the bill, even given, you know, what's happened with COVID-19, and it's raised issues that we weren't even thinking and talking about. And how can Act 250 help, you know, deal with some of the changes that Vermont might be seeing sooner than we thought.
Great. Well, my clock says it's 12:59, which is just about what we had scheduled. I want to thank everybody again, and hopefully we can continue the conversation next Thursday at noon.
Wait, there is one more question. Do you believe that Act 250 is equitable, given what we've discussed?
Whew, that's not a short answer question.
Or maybe you can discuss it next week as well.
Actually, there is I might not use the right term. There is an equity provision and standard in the law, in the bill that was passed out of the House, that was intended to promote greater equity through the Act 250 process. So we will talk about that next week.
That's great. And I did just put the link for the registration for next week's meeting in the chat. And I will be sending around a recording of this meeting in case you came late or wanted to share it with anybody else.
And just one final thing, this is for the foreseeable future, hopefully not the long term. We're going to be doing other programs on our Thursday at noon effort going forward. So this isn't, I appreciate everybody taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.